Hey man, chill out. Let your hair down. Take it easy. Brothers and sisters, we hope you all come together and really dig this groovy episode on hippies and flower power. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés con Reza y Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with nearly 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. How's it going, man?
It's going well, dude. And I'm really excited to be podcasting again with you this week, Reza, about hippies and hippie lifestyle. What's first this week, Reza?
Well, let's start off with a voice message all the way from Chile. It's from Francesco, or maybe it's pronounced Francesco, I'm not sure.
How you doing, guys? My name is Francesco Costanzo, and I am from Chile. Yeah, that's right, I'm not from Italy. But my grandpa came to Chile from Sicily a long time ago. That's why I have this kind of name. Well, just say thanks a lot for your amazing podcast and your friendly and easy way to teach us. That's really good. And if you have some piece of advice to improve my speaking skills, I'm gonna be really grateful. Because even when I have my brother to practice, he already speak English really good. It's hard to me speak fluidly, like I said before. I think that's it. Thanks again for your amazing job, and see you later.
Okay, you've answered my doubt there. It is Francesco, right? Yeah, that makes sense. Yep, Italian name, you've got Italian ancestors.
And thank you very much for your message, and well done for saying piece of advice. That's a mistake that many Spanish speakers do make, because advice, of course, as you know, Francesco, is uncountable. So it's a piece of advice. Well done.
Yeah, that was a really good message, Francesco. Your pronunciation is fantastic. Very, very good. There's always a but though, isn't there? But, dot. But there's one or two things we can improve. You were talking about your brother and you said he already speak English really good. Maybe it was just the microphone, maybe it's the quality, but I didn't hear that S, third person singular. Remember, we've got to say he already speaks. And you said English really good, but better to say English really well, the adverb.
That might be influenced from American English, because I do notice that American native speakers use good as an adverb, and they say, yeah, he speaks or he plays or he sings really good instead of well. In British English, it's more common to say well. And one other thing, Francesco, you said it's hard to me speak fluently. We can improve that with a couple of prepositions. It's better to say it's hard for me, not to me. It's hard for me to speak fluently. It's hard or difficult for me, and then the infinitive. It's hard for me to speak, it's hard for me to play, it's hard for me to go, etc. Thanks very much for your message. And improving your speaking, well, you're already speaking very, very well, as Reza said, especially with contractions like gonna. You said, I'm gonna be really grateful. You sound very natural and very fluent. But one thing that's become very popular in recent years is to join online communities and practice your English speaking with learners of English. So I suggest going onto Facebook, if you are on Facebook, or searching on Google for groups of people who are practicing together online. Are there any other ways you can think of, Reza, for fluency practice for speaking?
Well, keep sending in your feedback to us, and we'll be only too happy to comment on it. Just speak as much as you possibly can, above all to native speakers. Listen as well. Listen to native speakers, and just keep doing what you're doing, because the results seem to be good, Francesco. Your pronunciation is good.
And the most important thing, of course, is practice. Any way you can practice, whether that's speaking with a friend who's also learning, if you know any native speakers, try to speak with them, or if you don't, try to meet some online and start chatting with people in English. Just speak and practice, and with practice comes improvement. So let's focus on the topic for this week's podcast, which is hippies and hippie lifestyle. So what is a hippie or a flower child? There was a flower power culture, wasn't there, Reza, in the 60s? But what exactly is flower power?
Well, for most people, including me, if you're a hippie, that generally implies you're into the idea of flower power. You're into something means you're very enthusiastic about it. Now, flower power, is it about gardening? Is it about flowers? Not exactly. Let me tell you the Cambridge Dictionary explanation. Flower power, they say, is the ideas and beliefs of some young people in the 1960s and 1970s who opposed war and encouraged people to love each other. That's a good, simple explanation. I like that.
Yeah, me too. That sums it up very well. But the word hip, H-I-P, if you have studied anatomy or biology, you may recognize the noun hip as being cadera. But as an adjective, if you are hip, that means to be cool or to be aware of the latest trends or fashion. It's become quite a dated expression now, but it was very, very common in the 60s. To be hip means to be in the know, to know about what's happening and to be very cool and with it, I could say, to be with it.
Yeah, you've got to remember, particularly if you're a younger listener who missed the hippie movement when you were born, it was already finished, that the hippies were new in their day. So now we think of it as a historical period. It's over now. But in their day, it was a new idea. So it's logical that they were called hippies. They were hip, they were new then. So think of it as new at the time. But don't confuse it with the word hipster, which you hear a lot even these days. Although the word hipster itself, would you say, Craig, is even beginning to sound a bit old now? It's kind of lost its meaning. Hipster.
Well, I'm not really hip to the latest culture and expressions, which means I'm not really in the know. I don't keep up to date with what's happening. Sometimes I see people dressed as hipsters in Valencia, but I don't really know what the younger people are following these days, what trends that they're following. So I'm not sure if it's popular in Spain. Do you see many hipsters around Valencia?
I do, because I happen to live in the neighborhood where most of them seem to hang out.
You live in a very hip neighborhood, don't you?
Yeah, that doesn't mean everybody there who's cool. One look at me and you'd see that there are exceptions. But there are quite a lot of people that you might call hipsters, hip people who go there. But they're not hippies. Hipsters. So they're like modern day hipsters. They're bohemian, perhaps in their outlook a little bit like the original hippies, but they're probably going to be affluent. That means they got a bit of money. But then again, so did lots of the original hippies. They were from quite wealthy families. But here's the thing. Hipsters, I think of them living in gentrified neighborhoods.
What's a gentrified neighborhood?
Good question, yeah. So gentrify a neighborhood means to change it, to convert it into trendy. So it wasn't trendy, or it hasn't been very trendy, very hip up to now, but it's becoming trendy. It's attracting a lot of attention at the moment. It's developing. And the neighborhood I live in is undergoing that gentrification at the minute. So it's attracted hipsters. They like the change. They like to be where it's at.
Where it's at.
Where it's at, which is a very hippie expression, but you could still use it today. But the difference between hipsters and hippies is hipsters have no obvious philosophy on life. It's more about the way you dress. You're a bit bohemian, but they're not very clearly defined philosophies. Whereas hippies, which is our topic for today, the original 60s hippies, they were all about freedom, above all, going against the mainstream. The mainstream is the main current, what most people do, establish things. So going against that, being alternative, things like communal living, people living together, not in a communist way, but in a communal way. They weren't particularly into communism. Specific politics didn't particularly attract them. It was about being your true self, if you like, but without egoism. And above all, about love and peace, would you say?
Yeah, love and peace is very connected to the hippie movement. Love and peace, man. If you want to know more about hipsters, we did speak about them in a little more detail back in episode 102. So go to inglespodcast.com/102. And it's the episode about lifestyles, in which we also spoke about yuppies and millennials and Generation X. So Reza, when I think of hippies, I do tend to think about the city of San Francisco in California, but is that where it all started?
Well, who can say for sure? Things may have happened that aren't documented. That means there's nothing written about it, no books. But when people really start to take notice of this movement, seems to be in the early 60s in San Francisco. It grew, so it was a very small minority, but it grew and grew. But actually, the origins go back before that to something they call the Beat Generation of the 1950s. And that was very heavily influenced by literature. So people like Allen Ginsberg, who perhaps is not very popular now, but was an extremely influential writer at the time. Someone who's still got a pretty good reputation now is Jack Kerouac. Many people will have heard of the book On the Road. Very much a hippie idea, the idea you're traveling, kind of free spirit on the road, we're traveling. So those guys back in the 50s kind of sowed the seeds, like they planted the origin of the hippie movement, which then really took off. It really flourished in San Francisco in the 60s.
And then it spread to other countries. So the hippie movement didn't stay in the US because London at that time became a very colourful city. After the Second World War, it was a bit depressed. There wasn't a lot of work around. There wasn't a lot of money around. Everyone was recovering from the war. But then eventually in the 60s, then things started to improve. There was more money. And this reflected in shopping areas and cultural areas in the centre of London. For example, King's Road in Chelsea and Kensington, and a famous street you may have heard of, Carnaby Street, were very famous in the 1960s for clothes shops, fashion, clubs, and we can say that they were hot spots. They were hotspots. They attracted people to go there. And apart from London, Paris was also another important hippie centre. In fact, there were protests in the late 60s. Was it 68? There was a big protest a big march in Paris, and it got quite violent, if I remember.
So let's think a little bit about the culture which goes with hippies. When it comes to music, it was a very rich period. Certainly the flower power hippie movement definitely influenced many groups. For example, the Beatles. I'm not saying that the Beatles are all about being hippies. They're not.
They had a hippie stage, didn't they? They had a hippie period, I think.
That's it. I think basically everybody went through their hippie stage. Maybe they weren't lifelong or kind of dedicated hippies, but they definitely were influenced, and they had their few years when they were more kind of hippie. Think of some Beatles songs. So the Beatles really were the first British group to be very popular in America. And because they were into hippie ideals, that kind of helped to popularize it even further in America. But there's plenty of other big names. Before the Beatles, even Bob Dylan, of course, very heavily identified with the hippie movement. The Rolling Stones, maybe not so much, but maybe their early days, perhaps, quite hippie. Do you know the Grateful Dead?
Yeah, they're an American band, whereas the Stones were British, and they followed the Beatles over to the US, and they call that the invasion of British music. The Stones, the Who, the Kinks, the Small Faces were all British bands that went over to the States during that time, but the Grateful Dead were a really popular band that came from the hippie movement in the US.
Yeah, other kind of individual artists, which I identify heavily with the hippie movement, but not exclusively. Jimi Hendrix, so he was quite hippie. Yeah, blues was his thing, but he was blues and kind of soul and rock, but he was definitely quite hippie. Janis Joplin, very much so. The Doors, fairly intense hippie influence. In fact, do you know why they're called The Doors?
No, I don't.
They call themselves The Doors after a book, The Doors of Perception.
Oh, really?
Which was written by Aldous Huxley. And it's basically all about the incredible things your mind can do and see, particularly if it's helped along by drugs. So, The Doors of Perception, The Doors.
I did not know that.
Yeah. Simon and Garfunkel. So, do you notice there, Bob Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel, it's not all about rock, it's also about folk. For me, the two styles I most identify with the hippie movement are folk and rock. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And of course, not only music, when we look at fashion, going back to London again, Mary Quant released the miniskirts at that time, and it was famously modelled by an international model called Twiggy, originally British, and she was the first model, I think, who wore the miniskirt, a very, very short skirt. Another famous model at that time, I think, was the first supermodel, Jean Shrimpton, another British model who became very popular worldwide.
So the miniskirt is probably a very physical kind of expression of a deeper idea going on in the hippie movement, which is all about sexual liberation. Maybe it doesn't sound like any big deal to you now, particularly if you're a younger person. But back in the 60s, there was a lot of sexual repression, and it was really the hippies who wanted to bring sex out into the open, lose your inhibitions. If you like somebody and they like you, what's the problem? The social class, skin color, all of that, it doesn't matter. In fact, a lot of people forget or don't know that this guy I mentioned earlier, Allen Ginsberg, who's kind of one of the founding fathers of the hippie movement, was gay himself. So being gay and the hippie movement go hand in hand.
And what Reza said about sexual liberation was reflected in the Burn Your Bra movement, which was a movement in the 60s of sexual liberation for women and equality, to burn your bra and become equal with everybody. And also the idea of free love that was around at the time, where it was okay to be a homosexual, it was okay to have sex with whoever you wanted to.
Another important philosophy is the anti-nuclear and generally anti-war movement. So nuclear weapons were growing at an alarming speed. The Soviet Union and the United States were competing against each other, and the hippies arrived and they were against all of that, and they didn't care if it was America or Russia. They just wanted all weapons and arms to disappear and be replaced by flowers, things like that. Thus, the flower power movement.
Flowers and peace and love. And towards the end of the 60s, in 1969, a very important music festival took place in a place called Woodstock, which is a small town in the north of New York State. And it started as quite a small project, a small idea. They wanted to get a few bands together that were going to play music in a field and celebrate this hippie idea of love and peace and bring everybody together. But very quickly, it became hugely popular, which is interesting because in those days, there was no social media. How did people communicate with one another and say that there was this big illegal concert happening? Well, word of mouth. People told other people, and gradually it spread. And over 3 days of the festival, around 400,000 people went to this music festival.
To give you an idea, just to sum up the spirit of it, it was billed, that means it was advertised on the posters as an Aquarian exposition, 3 days of peace and music, which is a very kind of hippie sentiment. 3 days of peace and music. An Aquarian. The hippies, the early hippies often talked about the age of Aquarius, as being some kind of special moment in history, and they reckon that that moment was the age of Aquarius and strange and fantastic things were going to happen.
If you're interested in learning more about this Woodstock Music Festival, I've put a link in the show notes at inglespodcast.com/357 to a YouTube video, which is an hour's documentary including some fantastic music of popular groups at the time.
Craig, we've already mentioned some vocabulary, but can you think of any other words which we very much, words or maybe collocations which very much go along with the hippie movement?
Well, one is counterculture. One thing I think that really shocked and maybe frightened and scared the government and the people in charge at the time was the movement becoming so big and maybe threatening or putting in danger the people who were ruling the countries at the time. So this idea of a counterculture is suggesting another way to live that threatens the people who are in charge of the system.
And a very important concept for hippies was to have good vibes, good vibrations, yeah? Avoid bad vibes. So it's an expression that you still hear today, but it dates from the hippie period. It wasn't really used before that.
And I'm a bit too young. It's not often I get the chance to say that sentence, but I am a bit too young to remember the 60s. But I do remember the 60s. I kind of lived the 60s through my sister because she's 9 years older than me. And there's one thing I do remember having when I was very, very young, flares, flared trousers. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, I had trousers that used to be very, very wide at the bottom. And they were also called bell-bottom trousers because the bottom of the trousers looked like a bell. Did you have flares when you were younger?
Yeah, when I was a kid, I've got pictures of it. So I maybe can't remember wearing them, but I've got the photographs, unfortunately, to prove it. Yeah,
I'd like to see them sometime.
So for me, yeah, Craig, flares very much kind of encapsulate the hippie idea because there's a lot of space there. They're very loose. Yeah, so before that, people wore more tight-fitting clothes. So the hippie movement's all about being loose, being free, so lots of space. When you walk down the street, things blow in the wind, all of that.
Everything blew in the wind because the ladies were burning their bras, so everything was moving around then.
Exactly.
So we've already heard in this episode some references to vocabulary from last week when we spoke about gardening because flower power, Reza spoke about sowing the seeds before, and of course you can dig things when you're digging the garden, which is cavar. But when you use the verb to dig, referring to the hippie movement, that means that you really like it, that you're into it. Now, this word is kind of old-fashioned. I don't think you'd hear it used very much these days, but you would hear, I'm into it. So I'm into jazz music. I'm into photography. I like it very, very much. But in those days, in the hippie movement days, it was very common to hear, oh, I really dig the music, man. I really dig the vibe, which means I like it very much.
An expression which you'll hear a lot referring to hippies and the 60s, although it could be referred to any period in time, but it's a bit of a cliche, is to get high or to be high. Very often on drugs, but not necessarily. Sometimes people just said that they were really high in euphoria. But let's be honest, a lot of drugs were taken by many hippies. They often did smoke marijuana or cannabis, or to use more slang terms, to smoke pot, weed. Two things which were also in our last episode about gardening, pot and weed. Weed is mala hierba and pot is maceta, right? Or dope. D-O-P-E. Dope, I guess, comes from the idea that if you smoke marijuana, you feel a bit dopey. Dopey is like you don't quite know what you're doing. You're maybe a bit too relaxed. You're not very alert. And another drug of choice, very popular in the 60s, was LSD. LSD. And when people said that they were going to drop acid, what they meant was they were taking LSD. And they might be tripping out, going on a trip, not taking a bus or not getting in the car, but in their mind, a very hippie idea. So dropping acid, going on a trip, all these things, they're all very kind of psychedelic. The idea of altered reality and kind of reality and non-reality mixing into one, and we're not quite sure where the boundaries are. Psychedelia is all very much part of the hippie movement.
Have you ever dropped acid?
I never have, no, and I wouldn't. It frightens me.
Why does it frighten you?
It's a strong drug. You hear of people having a bad trip. People used to talk about, oh, leave John alone, hippies. Yeah, leave John alone, for example. He's on a bad trip. So the drugs reacted in a certain way and he's not having a good time. So that idea frightens me. I wouldn't do it. Apart from the fact that it's illegal.
Of course. No, I haven't either. Although I think I probably would have if it was offered to me many years ago when I was in my 20s. I possibly would have, but I was never in the company of people who dropped acid. I was never in that group of people. We used to drink alcohol. That was the way we got high. We didn't take drugs. It wasn't a thing back in London when I was growing up.
I think you were probably too late for it, and I definitely was. It was definitely bigger in the 60s and 70s than from the 80s onwards, right?
We can say we missed the bus.
Yeah.
We missed the psychedelic bus, Reza.
Yeah. Yes, psychedelic buses are very much an icon of the 60s, aren't they? Buses painted in psychedelic or strange colours where you can't quite interpret it 100%. Very hippie idea.
And of course, the idea of taking drugs and experimenting with things that change your psyche and give you different perspectives and views on life is to contact your inner self or your inner consciousness. And this is also connected to meditation that we spoke about in episode 339 as a way of dealing with stress. Now, we're not suggesting you take drugs to deal with stress, but the idea of reflecting inside yourself and looking inside your mind is one thing we spoke about in episode 339.
As we mentioned already, many hippies, most hippies, would have been anti-war protesters. They would have gone to an anti-war protest. Or another way of saying a protest is a demo. Demo, D-E-M-O. That's the short form of demonstration. Not manifestation, typical Spanish mistake.
Yeah, it's a false friend, isn't it?
False friend. Manifestación is a demonstration. And una mani, as you say, is a demo. So the hippies were often demonstrators. For example, there was an anti-Vietnam War demo here in 1968. So the anti-Vietnam War movement was particularly important to the hippies.
We spoke earlier on about being hip, being modern, being trendy, in touch with fashion. Well, if you were not like that in the 60s, you were called straight or square. So he's square, man, he's not hip, is a negative thing to say about someone.
And the word straight these days, Craig, I would say has a different meaning in the 21st century.
Yes, if you're straight, you're heterosexual.
Yeah, in the 20s. But that wasn't the case in the hippie period.
No, yeah, it's more these days about sexual preferences.
So the opposite of gay in the 21st century is straight.
Mm-hmm.
So it's lost that meaning of square.
It's interesting how words change their meaning over time.
Craig, if I were to say to you, hey man, turn on, tune in, drop out, what am I saying?
Get in the groove, which means get in touch with yourself, be part of the movement, free yourself, liberate yourself.
That was a common phrase used by hippies. I can't remember exactly who coined the phrase. We say to coin a phrase, C-O-I-N, the person who first said it, but it became very popular. I would say one last piece of vocabulary, which isn't strictly about the hippies, but it's kind of a later development of them, New Age or New Age travelers. So after the hippie movement had kind of disappeared or almost disappeared, from time to time you saw, and still do see these days, people who look a bit like hippies. They might be wearing very loose clothes. They travel around the place. Maybe they have a communal kind of lifestyle. But the hippie movement, as we know it, the original, has gone. It's had its time. It disappeared by the end of the 70s. So we call these kind of, if you like, new type of hippie, a new age traveler. And they're into the new age movement.
But a very similar philosophy, I think, very much into peace and using natural products as well.
Yeah. And probably the reason why I was interested in doing an episode on hippies is because it just so happens by chance that I lived in the New Age capital of England for 3 years. That's not why I went there. I discovered it when I got there. A place called Totnes in Devon is known as a mecca for New Age travelers. I went there in 1989. It was almost like going back in time 20 years in a way. There was a very, very hippie kind of atmosphere there.
Wasn't there also a Scientology place there?
There was and is. Yeah, you name it, they've got it. That's the first place I saw things like crystal rock shops. Whenever nobody had heard of them.
Is that drugs, Crystal Rock?
No, I'm talking about crystals like that have special powers.
Oh,
crystal
okay.
shops, like you use to give you power, that type of thing. And things like vegan restaurants and things like that. In a town of about 20,000, 30,000 people, there were 6 vegetarian restaurants. That's a hell of a lot. In 1989, 3 crystal shops, a dozen secondhand bookshops in a town of 30,000. I don't know if we got that many in Valencia today.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting atmosphere. That probably got me interested in the whole thing, I guess.
So we could say it was an eye-opening experience. We've got some quotes for you connected to the hippie era and the hippie movement. The first one by someone you should have heard of, and if you haven't, please go and listen to him on YouTube, Jimi Hendrix. He said, when the power of love overcomes the love of power, the world will know peace. And the word overcome is superar in Spanish. When the power of love overcomes or gets better or more powerful than the love of power, the world will know peace.
Here's another quote from John Lennon. I'd be very surprised if you've never heard of John Lennon, one of the Beatles. He said, if someone thinks that love and peace is a cliche that must have been left behind in the 60s, that's his problem. Love and peace are eternal. A very hippie sentiment.
The next one is from someone who I suspect was against the hippie movement. The ex-president of the US, Ronald Reagan, he said, a hippie is someone who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, and smells like cheetah. So if you don't remember Tarzan, or Tarzan, as you say, Jane was his partner, his love interest, and cheetah was the monkey.
I've got one here which is very ambiguous. I like the ambiguity of it. I'm not sure if he's praising hippies, like being positive, or criticizing them. It's Neil Young, the musician, who I think performed at Woodstock. And he said, give a hippie too much money and anything can happen. I like that one.
Me too. But it definitely sounds positive, and I definitely suspect that Neil Young was a hippie.
Well, he was at Woodstock, which is fairly good credentials, yeah.
And by the way, Jimi Hendrix was also at Woodstock, and he famously did a rendition, an interpretation of the American national anthem. Now, Woodstock was at the time of the Vietnam War, and his interpretation of the national anthem was incredibly hard for some Americans to listen to because he played it on his guitar in a way that butchered the national anthem to protest against America's involvement in the Vietnam War. If you haven't heard that, I suggest you do. It's difficult to listen to. Just try and understand the intention behind the way Hendrix was playing it.
I already mentioned a quote from a Beatle, John Lennon. I've got another one from another Beatle, George Harrison. This is one I really like. This is a very humble thing to say, humilde. He said, when you've seen beyond yourself, then you may find peace of mind is waiting there.
What's peace of mind?
Peace of mind is a collocation which means tranquility, not worrying about things, being at ease with yourself. So I think what he's saying here is try and get rid of your own ego, and that's when you'll be happy.
That's what I understood. Be at one with nature, yeah. And one more before we leave you. Joni Mitchell, who was a very famous singer in the 60s, she said, "They won't give peace a chance. That's just a dream some of us had." Now, Give Peace a Chance, of course, is from a song by John Lennon, Just Give Peace a Chance, and it's quite a depressing realization that it was a dream and probably they won't give peace a chance. And I think they here refers to governments and people in power, because there have always been wars, and unfortunately Joni Mitchell thinks there will never be peace.
So Craig, that's quite a depressing one in a way. But do you think the hippies did achieve something? Did they change many things?
I think they did. They certainly did a lot for sexual equality. I think women's rights really started in the 60s, and also sexual liberation. And also the idea that you could sort of challenge the government and have a counterculture, and that maybe the way that the system we're living under might not be the right one, and you have the freedom to choose another one if you want to. So I think it opened up doors to other ways of living. What do you think?
Yeah, I completely second that. I couldn't agree more.
If you're interested to hear some music from the 60s, we're going to put some links in the show notes over at inglespodcast.com/357. So specifically Bob Dylan, The Times They Are A-Changing. They were then and they still are now. All You Need Is Love. And one of Reza's favourite rock songs of all time. I'm not going to tell you what that is. You will have to go to the link in the show notes. So inglespodcast.com/357.
Okay, that's enough from us. Now it's your turn to practice. Why don't you send us a voice message? It's really easy. Just go to speakpipe.com/inglespodcast and record yourself.
Or you could send us an email. You can reach me, Craig, CRAIG, at inglespodcast.com, and Reza at belfastreza@gmail.com.
You could also visit the online store. Go to store, that's STORE, store.mansioningles.net, and there you'll find all sorts of interesting material to practice and further improve your reading, writing, speaking, listening, grammar, vocabulary, etc.
And as always, thank you very, very much to all of you who are helping us by supporting this podcast. You can see a list of all our Patreon supporters at Patreon, patreon.com/inglespodcast. We can't thank all of you here because there just isn't enough time, but we would like to welcome our latest Patreon supporters, who are Negesa Eminen, Enrique Gonzalvo, and Antonio Tomas Palacios. Thank you very, very much. What's next week, Reza?
Next week's episode, we're very much back to the 21st century, leaving the 60s behind and the hippies, Zoom, Skype, and internet conferencing vocabulary.
So we'll look forward to speaking about that next week and being more hip and up to date with vocabulary. Thank you very much for listening this week. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And take it easy from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later. Music also by Airtone. The track was Wu Chi. Creative Commons license from ccmixter.org.